Why is it so hard for some people to type themselves? I have some updated thoughts on this matter. I think one of the most important reasons, if not the most important reason, is because personality has an unavoidable subjective element. In other words, I cannot ever know with objective certainty what it is like to be you. And as such, I cannot ever know scientifically if what you are experiencing really is NE or NI or any of the other functions. I can only know this in a very different sense. I can only know it subjectively, which is fitting because, after all, personality is the study of human subjects. This is actually a problem for all of psychology generally, though it does not seem to me that it's recognized openly by those in the field today. Even supposing that I could do a brain scan and say, you have a chronically depressed brain, or you have an Asperger's brain, that still does not tell me anything about how you, the ghost in the machine, experience the activity of that brain. The experience of a mental illness is not equivalent to the neurological activity associated with it, for the simple reason that people interpret their experiences differently and have different ways of communicating that experience, and we each have different frames of reference for interpreting that communication and linking it up with a diagnosis. Most of the time, we miraculously overcome these hurdles and enjoy a kind of sympathetic parallelism, as Jung put it, a happy moment where I just know that you really have experienced what we're talking about, that we really have shared a subjective experience. But the possibility for confusion is always there. I believe that much of the controversy over psychology and psychiatry is rooted in the naivete of some practitioners who seem to think they are dealing with human objects, not human subjects. A neurologist is not the same thing as a psychologist, any more than a mortician is the same as a grief counselor. When I first addressed this topic several years ago, I tentatively suggested that the best method for ending the endless cycle of type searching is to simply pick a type and stick with it until it becomes practically impossible to reconcile it with one's life. At the time, I did not fully understand the rationale behind that idea. Let's say it was an intuition. But I think I'm beginning to understand that rationale now. One has to pick a type, I think, because that is how all psychological diagnoses necessarily are in the end. I have received a number of medical diagnoses in my life, as I'm sure you have. I've been diagnosed, for instance, with a broken wrist. And I know this diagnosis is correct with objective certainty because I was shown the X-ray. But I have also been diagnosed with OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. I believe this diagnosis, but my belief is not and cannot be predicated upon the same kind of evidence as my broken wrist was. For my broken wrist was an object. It was an objective fact open to public view. But my subjective experience of the breakage was not necessary to the diagnosis of broken wrist. But with OCD, my subjective experience is the basis of the diagnosis, and as such, the doctor is forced to rely upon my account of things. They don't have to do that with a broken wrist, they can just look at the broken wrist. Though with OCD, it's different. They must trust that I'm telling the truth. Also, that the language I use to describe myself corresponds properly with the doctor's language. Furthermore, the only feedback the doctor receives to guide their diagnosis are my own assent and dissent to what they say. These problems cannot be solved objectively. The subjective element is irremovable. If I have a depressed brain but report no feelings of depression, then do I really have depression? And if I have a depressed brain and accept I have a depressed brain, treatment of the brain alone will not perfectly alleviate the symptoms. This is a very commonly understood principle in psychology. There must be a corresponding subjective activity or change. And the only way that can happen is if the patient accepts the diagnosis and makes the changes themselves. This is, by the way, why Jung believed that psychological treatment involved a certain moral effort on the part of the patient, because morality is of the subjective realm, the realm of the will. When it comes to subjective confirmation, things start becoming very contextual. That is to say, people with NI or FI are more comfortable here because, for better or worse, these types are more in touch with and more responsive to the needs and goals of their own subject. In the last analysis, I assented to the diagnosis of OCD because I believed it useful to me in my life. I saw that it allowed me to do what I wanted to do psychologically because I had this notion of what I wanted to do psychologically. But NE and FE are not contextual. They are universal. This means that they are much more sensitive to the dangers of subjective confirmation. It feels too arbitrary to them. They are very uncomfortable assenting to a diagnosis just because it is useful to them in some way. How do they know that what puny them thinks is really useful to them in the long run? They are not willing to make that Kierkegaardian leap of faith. No, they only assent when something seems inevitable to them, when it seems sufficiently, as it were, commanded to them by force of proof or authority or common sense or whatever it is. They want, in other words, something external and objective to impose its truth upon them, rather than them imposing their truth upon the world. It is noteworthy that much of so-called postmodern thought is NE-related, because NE is naturally skeptical of anything originating from the mere subject. NE is always pointing out the prejudice and short-sightedness that motivates NI's beliefs. It places NI back into the subject, and on those grounds humiliates it because of how small they make the subject appear in comparison to the universe. Of course, the universe is viewed through the subject, so in that sense the universe, from another point of view, is actually smaller than the subject, is contained within the subject. But in any case, in this video, I've tried to show one of the principal reasons for the struggle in typing oneself, namely that type cannot be objectively confirmed. Voltology, or face reading, contests this point, claiming, in an argument somewhat reminiscent of Wittgenstein, or the later Wittgenstein, that inner experience is reliably coordinated with external acts, and all that goes on inside of us is really open to public view, if only we were to look for it. Similar kinds of attempts to find definitive objective grounding for subjective experience have been undertaken by Dave Superpowers and others, I'm sure. All respect to them. They've recognized the problem before I did, by the way, and their efforts are sure to open up more and more reliable links between subjective experience and objective action, and that's, I think, very useful in a lot of ways. I'm ending this video without having established much of my own solution to this problem, and that's because I really don't have one yet. I think it wiser to vet my analysis with the world and see what people have to say before I start giving advice. So that's all I have on that problem for now. So, cheers.